So I've gone through and I've done my detail pass. There's a couple of things that I've done that you'll need to keep track of. First off is to get my lighting not looking completely hideous, which I'm sure you've noticed that some of your walls are doing some very odd things at this point. I've just clicked the build button up the top, which builds your lighting. I've also saved my map. You can do that by just clicking Save Current, or alternatively going File, Save Current As, which will save it as a specific name. In this situation, I've called my demo map pre-lighting, and the reason for that is that I wanted to have a save point that was before I actually started correctly adding my lights to the map. So if I go through here, I'm just going to show you some of the smaller details that I've added. First off, you can see that we've added some tiny things such as the light switches to the walls. We've added books to all of the bookcases, so these have just been added and then manually kind of rotated to look slightly nicer. The material on the books automatically changes the color according to their position. If I go across the room as well, I can see that we've got this. So I've added a coat hook to when you first walk in. I've added this little environment here, which is made to just look like an adjoining corridor. I thought this was nicer since it kind of opened up the space a little bit more. I've added some statues up top and some pot plants down here, as well as a couple of vases. It was kind of sneaky, and I shrunk one of these pot plants and put it in the vase. As well as that, I've gone ahead and I've added this outdoor area. So you can see here that we have just a very simple fence that's running along the outside with just a tile. Now I'm sure you've noticed that I have no material set up for this outside area. So I have no material set up for it because I never want the player to go out there. I only ever want them to see it from this perspective. I've also gone ahead and added a building and an atmospheric area out here. So to do that, the building itself is just a background card, so you can just drop that in this here. I scaled it up to 65 times size, so it's huge, at which point I dropped my camera to about here, placed it in, and then positioned it so that it was nice. To get the atmosphere effect, I went ahead and added an atmospheric fog actor. Now, an atmospheric fog actor is added by just dragging it in from here. I typed in the word Atmo, and atmospheric fog came up, so it's in my place menu, my place mode. When I drop that in, it's automatically going to look similar to this, but not quite the same. And that's because the atmospheric fog simulates what the atmosphere would look like given the sun's position, but it needs to have one very important piece of information, and that is it needs to know where the sun is. So you need to tell it which directional light in your scene is the sun. To do that, it's very simple. You just click on the directional light that you have in your scene, and if you go to your search tab and type in the word Atmo, you'll see that we have atmosphere sunlight is one of the options. If I uncheck that, you'll see what it looks like by default. And then if I check it, it'll automatically put the sun in the correct position so that the rotation of this directional light matches up with where it is in the distance. Now the atmospheric sun can be tweaked in all sorts of nice ways. I can click sun multiplier and I can crank up just how bright that sun is in the distance. And I can handle all sorts of other areas like how much fog is coming through, the size of the sun disk itself. So, you know, we can really tweak this. In this situation though, I'm just going to keep all of my defaults because it's nice enough for the outdoor environment. We don't really need to modify it too much. Instead, I'm going to go ahead and start actually working on my lighting pass. So with that said, can you save your map and make sure that you've saved it something that is like pre-lighting? And once you've done so, we're going to, in the next session, start going through and adding lighting and then post-processing. So now that it's time to actually light the map, it's a good idea for us to go File, and I'm going to File and Save Current As, and I'm going to call mine Demo Map Post Lighting. And the reason for that is I want to save it so it's something that whenever I save, I've got something that I can fall back on that's before lighting. Now you don't need to do this, it's up to you. If you want, you can just keep powering ahead, but I like to kind of keep checkpoints of where things were. It's also good for later if you want to see how the environment progressed. So the first thing I want everyone to do is go through and we're going to go ahead and delete the lights around the map. So all of the point lights, we'll keep the directional light for the time being, but I want you to go through and just remove any point lights that are still sitting there within your scene. Hit delete, and then I'm going to go up to the top and I'm going to click build. Now, in building lighting, it's just going to cast all of the lighting into the world, and you should get something that looks vaguely like this. That's basically what we want to have for our starting position. The first thing that we're going to do is basically focus on this light and then go from there. So I'm going to click on my directional light. At the moment I've still got my filter when I was looking for my atmospheric sunlight, and I can remove that by clicking on the X. And when I get into this, I can see that there are some things that we can tweak and change. Now, the first thing that I want to do is I want to activate a feature called Cascading Shadow Maps. Now, see how at the moment when my light comes in, it looks like this? It's not exactly pretty, and it's definitely not how the sun should really be looking. So I'm going to scroll down, and you'll see that there is a section here called Cascaded Shadow Maps. Now, how Cascaded Shadow Maps work is they basically project a dynamic shadow from the sun that is a much clearer and harder shadow than you would get if you were to bake things in. When you bake in lighting, it automatically kind of blurs between the values, which can look okay, but it's definitely not the result you want most of the time. So as an example of how cascading shadow maps work is I'm going to turn this number to 200. And if I start approaching the shadows, you can see that whenever a shadow from the sun is 200 units away from me, it starts bringing in a nicer version. Now, in a game, it would really matter about how optimized we were with this value. For instance, if I did 500, I would need to be aware that, things are going to change at a distance. It doesn't matter so much for architectural visualization, but there are some values that you should be aware because of it. So, for this, I've already gone ahead and put in a couple of base values, but the defaults look like this. Now, the first thing that I want to show you after the dynamic shadow distance is this one down the bottom that says distance fade out fraction. Now, if I was to set this to 0.5, you can see that the blend between static shading and dynamic shading is much, much, much longer. If I go 1, then it never is truly fully dynamic. It's always fading out over the course of its shadow. Do you see that? Now, if on the other hand I was to set that to 0 and move backwards, you can see that there is a very harsh line where the two of them are meeting, so where the static comes in. So in my situation, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to keep this distance fraction to be about 0.2, and I'm going to increase the dynamic shadow distance to just about 2000, because this I know will always capture the entire map, so it should look pretty good all the time. Now, there are some other things we can do. For instance, we could change the number of dynamic shadow cascades. This essentially is going to create a lower or higher res shadow map on your scene, which can look really good, but can be something that increasing the numbers doesn't always increase the quality, but it does definitely increase the rendering cost. So you really want to be careful about how you do this. It basically kind of splits the shadow into a couple of maps and bakes them out separately. To be honest, the default values are usually pretty good here, and unless you're having some serious issues, it's not worth tweaking. If I increase this or decrease this, I can change how they blend between one another with this transition fraction. So those are all very useful values, but 9 times out of 10 I'm keeping them pretty close to the defaults, apart from enabling it with a specific shadow distance and controlling how soon those fade out. So we've now got this happening, and it's about time for us to now add a light mass importance volume around our environment. So to do that, I'm going to go up to here in my placement, and I'm going to type in light. And you'll see that one of them is called a light mass importance volume. And when I drag this into my scene, we have this. Now, essentially, a light mass importance volume is used to tell the scene where the actual lighting that we care about in our environment is. So it's kind of telling us where the main level is. So you always want to wrap this snugly around your map without too much overflow. 1000 was almost right for me, but I'm going to go 1200, which is probably a little bit too big, but not too bad. So I'm going to go 1200 by 1200, so I know I've got a big box around the map. And I'm going to increase the height to be, I'm going to call 400 to be safe. Cool. Now, after we add the light mass importance volume, which just gives us more accurate lighting results, I'm going to go ahead and I'm also going to add something called a light mass portal. Now, light mass portals were added a couple of versions ago, and they're one of those things that kind of sneaks into the engine that people don't really know about, so it's really, really important to use them. So you can see that when we've finished building lighting, the light mass importance volume has more accurately calculated how light should be bouncing around the room, and we're getting this extra light around here, which is substantially nicer than what we had when we did our first bake, where it was a stark black on light contrast. So I'm going to add my light mass portal, which essentially tells the game, if you're casting light near me, make sure that I put a whole lot of light through this area is in an accurate way. So it's a good way to essentially denote where windows are, or in my case, transparent doors, so that the game correctly calculates lighting going through those things. And that's because that typically when you do something like this, your windows, you always want to have like nice natural lighting, coming through them. So it's a good idea to kind of tell them where your area actually is and let it kind of adapt to it accordingly. So the values that I need for this are 120 on the Z, and I'm going to call it 140 on the Y just to be a little bit more accurate. I'm going to call 20 on the X as well, just so I know that I've definitely encompassed that entire opening. Now, when I hit builds, this should give us slightly nicer results. It might be a little bit hard to see initially, but believe me, when you have more windows, this really can make quite a difference. So with those in place, we're going to start looking at how we handle the actual smaller sublights within our scene. We have lighting now kind of coming in, casting some nice shadows on the scene, but it's about time that we start looking at these lights that I've placed on the roof and putting some actual projections to them. I went and added the SM round ceiling light to the world. I also went through and changed its material from the ceiling light matte inst to ceiling light matte lit inst. And if you see the difference there, it's that versus that. And it's at this point that I'm going to go through and I'm going to start adding some spotlights to these to kind of correspond with what we're seeing. You know, we can have an emissive looking object, but if there's no light coming off of it, then we clearly have something wrong. So I'm going to drag in my first spotlight, and I'm just going to place this to make sure that it's flush against... There we go. So about there. Now, one thing that's worth noting here is that the reason I place these these lights close to the walls is I really like this effect of illuminating an object within the scene. If I was to get the same object and alt drag across to here, you can see that again we can kind of create this really nice effect, especially along something like a feature wall. So initially, how a spotlight works is it projects light through this cone up until the point where it reaches its attenuation distance. So see how at the end of this, it's projecting light all the way through to here? We don't want that. We want to make sure that our lights are set up as snugly as possible and they're not going too far. So I'm going to set this to 400 as that kind of nicely goes beneath the floor, but only just by a little margin. And I'm going to set that on both lights. I think the overall radius of the lights is probably okay. We can tweak that later if need be. But essentially what I'm going to do for the time being is click on each of these, and I'm going to alt drag across and just place all of my lights within the map. It's worth noting that it's a good idea to make sure things like lights kind of align in a logical way. The reason being is that because lights are typically placed by architects, they're not kind of added in a free-form way. They're usually spaced out, in theory, rather nicely. So I'm going to add that there, and I'm going to drag this over here and just add some more of these around. Now, because this section of my roof, because it dips down a bit, I'm going to have to make sure that I dip my light down to correspond with that. And I'm going to go ahead and add this other one here. Now, before I go any further, I'm going to go ahead and change one other thing, which is I'm going to go Window and enable World Settings. And after I've done that, I'm going to go to my World Settings, and I'm going to scroll down until I get to this section called Light Mass. Okay? Now, within my Light Mass section, there's a section that says Number of Indirect Lighting Bounces. And by default, how it works is light is calculated by bouncing from here onto the surface, and then it bounces to somewhere else in the room. And it does this 3 times. But I'm going to crank this up to 100, just to make sure that any subtle lighting that would be bouncing around the room is captured nicely. And I'm going to now build lighting for the first time with these in my scene. Fantastic. So you can see that by adding those into the world, we kind of get this nice vibrant lighting kind of pushing out that has a nice split between the artificial lighting, which is these lights, and the natural lighting that's coming in from the window, which is this nice sun. So we can see that everything is reasonably well lit, but there is a nice distinguishable line between the two. The other thing that I think is probably worthwhile us doing is getting a couple of these lights and lighting this interior area that I added. Now if you haven't added the interior area, that's fine. But because I've got it, I'm going to quickly drop these in. And I should probably add one down the end as well. So I'm setting these up. You can see that I'm getting an X here, and the reason for that is that by default these assets can only overlap up to 4 other stationary lights. So at the moment I'm using stationary lighting. I could use static or movable. Essentially how this works is if you add a movable light is completely dynamic, and it renders all of the shadows dynamically, and you can remove them and add them to the world, and they look good, but you definitely don't want to use them as an environmental light, purely because their shadows don't have all of this nice pre-baking. Now, next up we have a stationary light, which is somewhere in between a static and a movable light. So a stationary light can't move, and it allows you to do partially baked lighting. It gives you nice dynamic shadows from objects in the scene if you want to, and it can also be tweaked, so you can change things like the color of stationary lights as you go. Finally, we have static light. This fully balanced, baked into the world, but it can't be changed in any way at runtime. I don't mind too much about having this light here as a static light, and as this light here also as a static light, because it's only going to be like subtle lighting that's coming out of here. It's kind of this extra area that's stacked in the background. Now the reason that most of these are currently still overlapping is if I select them all, I'm sure you'll see the issue. If I scroll down, you can see that they're just overlapping by a tiny fractional amount on the corners of their attenuation radius. Now you can always kind of try and fix this by just tweaking this attenuation radius to find like a nice area that's still forgivable before they hit that point where they overlap. 390 somehow works. So I'm going to just change these around until I get something that works. And you can also limit your cone angle by a little bit as well. By default it's 44. I might just drop it down just a tad. So with these two lights now set to static, after doing a lighting build, these things have kind of worked themselves out and everything is now calculating correctly. It's worth noting at this point that if I wanted to, I could set every light in this scene to static. It wouldn't matter too much, but because there's a chance of wanting to kind of like dial these down dynamically and whatever else, I'm going to try and keep them stationary for as long as I can, manage the scene and work from there. So now that we have the basics in, we have all of the lights themselves added, it's time for us to start looking at the finer details for lighting. And one of the big aspects of this is reflections. We'll cover this in the next video.